Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've done a lot of work as we've moved toward the Pequot War, and we're there. Although the prelude and the lead-up was years in the making, it was not a long, drawn-out war. It was short and decisive. It humbled the Pequots. It put the other native tribes on notice. Most importantly, it helped to establish the dominance of Boston over practically all of New England. And today's episode marks the 13th under the banner of, quote, the Pequots, end quote. We've talked about them for somewhere between 6 and 8 hours, I'm guessing. I didn't go back and look at the lengths of the episodes. I hope this has been profitable. Some of the podcasts that I listen to release these multi-hour episodes. And so they work through these types of situations over the course of a few longer episodes. That's a good format. It allows them to work through these events seemingly quicker, I think. But the reality is, either way these are presented, there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of events and people that really matter to the storyline that popular history tends to leave out. They might be deemed insignificant. People may not have the attention span. Some people may just want that rah-rah overview where they can feel informed and walk away knowing how great their side was, as if they'd been there. But through the episodes we've covered, frankly, not just with the Pequots, but the whole purpose of this podcast, I wanted to show the long game and the many events and people that influenced and instigated the Pequot War. Because like any of the seminal events that happen in our own lives, there's always a long game, and there's always many events and people along the way that influence and instigate that particular situation. There's a lot to learn about how people treat one another, how different groups can look, how some groups are much maligned undeservedly, and others are praised and celebrated without a lot of critical thought behind how they succeeded. Every people group that occupies land took it from someone else, for some reason. It's not very often the former occupants voluntarily gave up their land. So the idea isn't to land-based one group and excuse another. It's more about working through the facts as best we can with some personal observations along the way. So over the course of the last few months, the goal has been to draw as accurate a picture as possible of the situation and events that led to the Pequot War. It might not be exhaustive, but I think it's pretty comprehensive. The Pequots have a reputation of bloodthirsty killers. But what we've seen is often just the opposite, at least in their dealings with the English. They tried again and again to make peace with the Europeans. The problem is that they not only dominated many of their neighbors, they had come to dominate the wampum production and also played a major role in the fur trade. And they had few allies at this point, and the Europeans wanted what they had. It was the Europeans that seemed to set the expectations too high for their relationship. They made very lopsided treaties to their advantage and to the Pequots' disadvantage. Time and again, the Pequots would try to reestablish good relations, only to be stymied. As we've worked through the narrative of the last years of the Pequot Nation, we've seen that the murders and atrocities they committed were generally murders and atrocities that were more proportional retribution for wrongs that they had suffered. Whether it was the killing of the Narragansetts outside the Dutch trading post, because the Dutch had engineered a treaty with the Pequots that could endanger them. I mean, that's the event that set this whole situation in motion. From that killing, the Dutch killed Tadebum, the main Pequot sachem, and after his death, the leadership fractured, and smallpox set in. And they, in an attempt to avenge their sachem's murder, killed John Stone. He was a vile man, but his murder was just the type of excuse the English needed to press the Pequots. And from there, things had only escalated. In the end, they could never quite give enough to the English to move past these events, and hostilities grew. The overflow population of Massachusetts Bay that descended on Connecticut overwhelmed everybody. The Pequots, who had agreed to let them settle there unmolested, the Dutch, the Plymouth plantation folks, the other native groups, The entire region was one big exasperated powder keg. It was bound to blow up at some point, and that's where we pick it up today. Along the way, there have been general applicable lessons for our own times, and there will be more to come. It was truly a clash of cultures. As we developed last week, the Europeans had been greatly shaped and molded by the continental bloodshed of Europe, as well as the philosophy of Machiavelli. The Algonquin approach was very different than the European approach, and the Europeans failed to appreciate or recognize this. And I hope the picture of where we've been is clear, because in this episode, the Pequots will begin to act more aggressively, more along the lines of what we would have expected years earlier, more along the lines of how at least I would have acted toward the newcomers that were so demanding and impossible to please. Just as they began to unleash their fury on the frontier settlements, the English were busy rallying their own troops to meet the Pequots head on. No more defensive tactics. They were about to become very offensive in their approach. We introduced this idea last week when we ended our time by saying, in part, quote, at the same time as the Connecticut frontier began to awake to the reality of the Pequot threat, at the same time as the various groups had converged on Saybrook, there arose another menacing situation. It had been building for a while and was now coming to a head. It was not Saybrook this time. The folks at Weathersfield had provoked a local sachem over land rights for their own expediency, and this sachem had taken his grievance to the Pequots. Just what all sides needed right now, another player in the game. At any rate, the attack on Weathersfield represents both a culmination of events and a new series of events, escalated, intense, and very violent. End quote. So let's see what happened at Weathersfield. I think today we'll look at the actual assault, but we may leave the aftermath for later. We're entering the final weeks of Pequot hegemony and the beginning of consolidated English power. So by 1637, there were quite a few settlements in the Connecticut River area. It was a region where a man or woman or an entire group could make a fortune and create a really good life for themselves. And there were a lot of people groups who tried. There were a lot of native groups. The Dutch were the first Europeans to really try to exploit the region, and then came the English. John Oldham was among the first to come to the area. It was 1633. The following year, late in the year, after the Treaty of 1634 was made, the floodgates opened for the Massachusetts Bay population to move west and settle in the region. It was John Oldham who led a small group in the winter of 1634 and 35 to stay at Pequot, which would become Wethersfield. They had come from Massachusetts Bay, the Watertown area. Actually, there are 3 settlements that emerged, all to the north of Saybrook: Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield. The Dutch and the folks from Plymouth were still active in the region, but their stars were fading. The arrival of the Massachusetts Bay settlers made life a little harder on everybody. Although many of these people had come for the dual opportunity to both escape the rigors of life under the Massachusetts Bay magistrates and to make money, they were still dependent on Massachusetts Bay. When push came to shove, they still looked to and relied on Massachusetts Bay. And push was coming to shove. These newcomers were pretty obnoxious in that they tried to replace the Dutch and the folks from Plymouth Plantation, their own countrymen, and the natives. So they left the hardships of England for Massachusetts Bay, and then had experienced yet another difficult political system. And so they moved away from that one as well, only to bully their new neighbors. It's funny how people act, isn't it? It's oftentimes how it is. The bullied becomes the bully. So keep in mind also, when we talk about these 3 settlements, we're not talking about sprawling metropolises at this time. I mean, combined, they only had about 250 people at this point. That gives you some idea of how desolate the area was, how vulnerable these settlements could be. It was Wethersfield that would feel the might and the fury of the Pequots. And they brought a lot of this on themselves. As you can tell by the original name, this was not a barren, uninhabited wasteland. It was occupied by the Wanguk tribe. Their sachem was Sequin, or Sequoian by some accounts. As winter broke, the hostilities escalated between the Pequots and Saybrook, and this brought about a renewed interest in the safety of the fort by both Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay. Now, if you remember, both colonies, if you want to consider Connecticut a colony at this point, both colonies, Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay, had sent their own delegations to the fort. John Mason had brought 7 men in the unofficial name of Connecticut, but departed when John Underhill arrived with 20 men from Massachusetts Bay. Again, kind of an unofficial expedition. What we'll see a little later was that John Mason had returned to Hartford to report what went on and to get more men. And this time, his appointment and his orders would be official. The point here is to understand that because of the support being sent to Saybrook, the Pequots began focusing on other areas to menace. It drew some of their attention and energy away from the fort and toward other places. And it was at this time that the good people of Wethersfield made a tactical error. Now, I don't know if they would have eventually ended up on the Pequots' radar or not, but the Pequots were looking for English victims, and Wethersfield drew their attention in a most unfortunate way. So anyways, Wethersfield had acquired land from the Wangunk and their sachem, Sequin. The deal was that Sequin and his people would be able to live there among the English. These guys were not Pequots. They were one of the groups the Pequots wanted to dominate. As a matter of fact, they had fought 3 very bloody and costly wars against the Pequots. So these guys weren't wimps either, but I guess by now they probably had seen their numbers diminish and they were probably more and more vulnerable. And they'd also sought protection from the Narragansetts. So when the English arrived, it probably seemed like a good idea to befriend them. They could offer additional protection against the Pequots. And plus, the English were allies with the Narragansetts. But it didn't take long before trouble arose. The Massachusetts Bay settlers picked a fight with Sequin when he tried to build a wigwam in Wethersfield, and they didn't just pick a fight with him, they drove him out of town. And this was early 1637, just around the time of Joseph Tilley and Thomas Stanton's arrival at Saybrook, just around the time Saybrook was beginning to receive support. Sequin wanted revenge. So predictably, especially in light of what was already going on between the Pequots and the combined forces of English and Narragansett, Sequin turned to his old enemy, now a pretty attractive ally, for help. This was just the kind of opportunity the Pequots were looking for. They were none too happy to lend a hand. So on the morning of April 23rd, 1637, the Pequots and their new friends, the Wangunk, attacked Wethersfield. Depending on the source, there were either 100 or 200 warriors in the party. I think one difference, as I've tried to sift through that difference myself, that discrepancy, one difference in the numbers might be if you counted just the Pequots or the combined force. So I'm not sure, but somewhere between 100 and 200 warriors. That's a formidable force. That's a formidable force, generally speaking, but certainly was for a small, isolated community. It would seem to me that the warriors may have actually outnumbered everybody at Wethersfield combined, men, women, and children. But it's interesting to note that even now, the Pequots did not simply wipe everybody out. They did do a lot of damage, however. The residents were taken completely by surprise, primarily because they did not expect an attack. But as the record indicates, even once warned, they were too slow to respond. What happened was that early in the morning, a horseman riding near Wethersfield came upon a large group of warriors sneaking their way toward town, and he immediately rode ahead and sounded the alarm. The women gathered around and asked how the Pequots were so far north. And as they discussed this, the warriors actually entered the town. Run, right? Hadn't they heard what was going on around Saybrook? What's wrong with these people? Anyways, you'd think that they'd all have been on high alert, that would have sent everybody into a tizzy. Saybrook wasn't that far downriver. It's not like they were as far away as Boston, right? So anyways, the Pequots were in the village, and the fun soon began. The women tried to run, but 3 of them were caught. One fought so hard that she was killed right where she was, and the other 2 were taken. And as they worked their way through the village, they came upon a work detail. And here, they killed 6 men and 2 more women. and they butchered 20 cows and a horse. Now, the news of the Wethersfield massacre traveled fast. 2 days later, a Dutch trader brought the news to Saybrook, and they immediately began to reinforce the fort in anticipation of a similar attack. That attack never came. What did happen during the business of preparation was that a smaller raiding party did sail past Saybrook, and they had the girls with them. The natives were very festive and jovial. They were celebrating. They taunted the onlookers. They actually had made makeshift masts in their canoes, so they put these poles up, to look like masts on an English vessel. And on these masts, in the place of sails, they had hung the clothes of the Wethersfield victims. That's kind of gruesome, kind of taunting. They also yelled that the English were all squaws and that their god was an insect. I mean, like I said, they were festive and jovial. Seems kind of sophomoric in their antics, if you ask me, but they were feeling pretty good about themselves. And the English responded to their approach pretty much the only way they could have. And Alfred Cave quoted John Underhill, who was there, as he recorded this, quote, "As the Pequots approached the fort, we gave fire with a piece of ordnance and shot among their canoes. And though they were a mile from us, yet the bullet grazed not above 20 yards over the canoe where the poor maids were." End quote. And again, Cave, quoting from Underhill's memoirs of this time, said that by his calculation, the shot missed its target, quote, "by a special providence of God," end quote. Because Underhill felt if the girls had been killed by their fire, they would, quote, "have been deprived of the sweet observance of God's providence in their deliverance," end quote. I don't know, by the remarks of Underhill, if they would have actually fired on the canoes again or not. But after the initial shots were fired, the Pequots wisely moved out of range. Edward Johnson, another eyewitness to this episode, saw this as a holy war between the people of God and the people of Satan. He said their speech, quote, "betrayed their horrible pride, fitted themselves for destruction," end quote. With the attack on Wethersfield and now the taunting of Saybrook, both sides were fully engaged. Actually, both sides had been for at least a little while. The English had been passive-aggressive. They had not actually gone on the offensive a whole lot. They just made demands and breathed threats. The Pequots had been terrorizing the countryside, especially around Saybrook, but had not really fully engaged. The truth is that just 5 days prior to Wethersfield, on April 18th, the Massachusetts Bay General Court met for the, quote, "special occasion of prosecuting the war against the Pequots," end quote. Not long after the massacre, and as a direct response to it, on May 16th, the Connecticut General Assembly declared an offensive war against the Pequots. Although the colonies or regions came to the same conclusions, that does not mean that there was harmony among the English. They each had different reasons for engagement. They had varying views on how an offensive war should be conducted, or why there had to be an offensive war at all. Plymouth and the city of Boston both dragged their feet getting into the war. Truth be told, Boston's contribution was minimalized due to infighting and the antinomian controversy and the exchange between Governor Vane and then the election of Governor Winthrop and all of the things that went with that. And Plymouth missed the engagement altogether due to their irritation with how Massachusetts Bay had conducted itself. Now, they eventually committed troops, but not for the sake of Massachusetts Bay or the folks living in Connecticut. And it was also at this time that Uncas, the rebel Mohegan Sachem, made his move to side firmly and permanently with the English, to their benefit and his. But those are all stories for another time. But until then, I hope our time together this time really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.